In the United States, one prison holds some of the most dangerous men ever convicted under Texas law. But what makes this place truly shocking is not just who is inside, it's how they live. Inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, inmates on Texas death row spend up to 23 hours a day alone in a concrete cell, sometimes for decades, waiting for a final decision that could end their lives. No contact visits, no group recreation, no way out except a successful appeal or a final transfer to the Huntsville Unit, where executions are carried out. According to reports from the Death Penalty Information Center, Texas has carried out more executions than any other state in modern American history. So what is life really like inside America's most isolated death row prison? Today, we're taking you inside the Polunsky Unit, where time moves slowly, the silence is heavy, and every inmate is waiting for something. If you enjoy real crime documentaries and prison stories based on true events, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel for more investigations into the world's most secretive prisons. Because what happens behind these walls, most people will never see. It was supposed to be just another prison. That's what people in Livingston, Texas, say. A quiet East Texas town of around 5,000 residents. Pine trees, church steeples, Friday night football. The kind of place where doors are left unlocked and neighbors wave from pickup trucks. And then there's the Polunsky Unit. Hidden behind razor wire and concrete walls sits one of the most isolated death row facilities in the United States. Here's the shocking fact. Texas has executed more inmates than any other state in modern American history. According to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and the Death Penalty Information Center, the state has carried out over 580 executions since 1982, and most of those men spent their final years, sometimes decades, inside a single building, the Allan B. Polunsky Unit. It's not where executions happen. That takes place in Huntsville at the Huntsville Unit. Polunsky is where inmates wait, sometimes for 20 years, sometimes for 30, sometimes until they die of natural causes before the state ever carries out the sentence. Former inmates, attorneys, and correctional officers have described it as one of the most restrictive death row environments in America. Lawsuits filed in federal court and investigative reports from outlets like the Marshall Project and the Texas Tribune have documented prolonged solitary confinement, limited human contact, and mounting mental health concerns. But to understand Polunsky, you have to understand how Texas got here. Before 1999, Texas death row inmates were held at the Ellis Unit. They could work. They had limited interaction. Some even played basketball in supervised groups. Then everything changed. In November 1998, 7 death row inmates attempted a high-profile escape from the Ellis Unit. According to court records and media reports at the time, the plan involved smuggled tools and detailed coordination. It failed, but it terrified officials. Within months, Texas transferred death row to a newer, more secure facility, the Allan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, and the rules became absolute. Single-man cells, 23 hours a day inside, no work programs, no group recreation, no communal meals, no physical contact visits. According to public TDCJ policies, death row inmates at Polunsky are housed in administrative segregation indefinitely. Unlike many other states where death row prisoners may earn privileges or move through classifications, Texas maintains strict isolation regardless of behavior. Former correctional officers, speaking publicly in news interviews, describe a routine built on silence and steel. Each cell measures roughly 60 square feet, concrete walls, a narrow window slit, a metal bunk bolted to the wall, a combined sink and toilet unit, a small desk slab. The lights never fully go dark, and the noise, when it comes, echoes. Men shout through vents. Some sing. Some argue with voices only they can hear. Multiple federal lawsuits filed by inmates and advocacy groups, including cases reported by the Texas Tribune and the Marshall Project, have alleged that prolonged isolation at Polunsky has led to severe mental health deterioration. Some former inmates claim hallucinations. Others report self-harm incidents. These claims are documented in court filings, though state officials have defended the system as necessary for security. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice has consistently maintained that policies are designed to protect staff and inmates, citing the 1998 escape attempt and security risks associated with housing individuals convicted of capital murder. This is not speculation. This is policy. And for the men inside, time moves differently. Take the case of an inmate we will call Daniel Reyes, a composite name used for privacy. His story is drawn from publicly available court documents and investigative reporting. Reyes was convicted of capital murder in Harris County in the early 2000s. According to court records, the crime involved the fatal shooting of a store clerk during a robbery. The jury sentenced him to death. After sentencing, he was transported to Polunsky. He was 27 years old. He is now in his late 40s. For more than 20 years, his world has been a concrete box. Reyes' appellate filings, publicly accessible, describe repeated complaints of anxiety, insomnia, and depression. Whether those symptoms are caused by confinement or pre-existing conditions is debated in court. But what is not debated is the length of isolation. 2 decades. Alone. Except for brief interactions with guards. Meals are passed through a slot. Recreation takes place alone in a caged enclosure, sometimes described by inmates as a dog run. Photos published in media reports show narrow concrete enclosures with fencing overhead, no trees, no sky beyond wire. Some inmates have described watching executions happen from afar, not physically, but emotionally, because at Polunsky, when an execution date approaches, the entire wing knows. In Texas, executions are carried out at the Huntsville Unit, about 45 minutes away. When an inmate's appeals are exhausted and a date is set by the court, he is transferred shortly before execution. According to public records, inmates are moved from Polunsky to Huntsville in the days leading up to their execution. Other inmates notice. The silence changes. Legal calls increase. Spiritual advisors visit. Then one day, the cell is empty, and it does not fill again. Inmates have described the psychological weight of living beside men who will be executed, and knowing their own names may one day be on the same schedule. According to data from the Death Penalty Information Center, Texas consistently leads the United States in executions carried out annually. However, the number has declined in recent years compared to the 1990s and early 2000s. Still, the waiting continues. Critics argue that decades-long solitary confinement may amount to cruel and unusual punishment. Several lawsuits have challenged the conditions under the Eighth Amendment. Some federal courts have allowed cases to proceed, while others have dismissed claims, citing security concerns and precedent. Supporters of the system argue something else. They argue that the men housed at Polunsky were convicted of the most serious crimes under Texas law, capital murder, often involving multiple victims, children, or law enforcement officers. Jury verdicts were reached after trial. Appeals were reviewed by state and federal courts. They say the isolation is necessary. The debate has raged for years. But inside the unit, debate doesn't matter. Routine does. Wake up. Tray through the slot. Count. Silence. Some inmates spend their time reading legal documents, preparing appeals. Others read religious texts. Some write letters. According to reporting by the Marshall Project, correspondence can become a lifeline. Volunteers, pen pals, attorneys. Human connection through paper. Because there are no handshakes, no hugs, no last-minute embraces with family through glass without touch. Texas death row does not allow contact visits. Everything is separated by barriers, even grief, even hope. Correctional officers who have spoken publicly describe the job as mentally exhausting. Monitoring men in isolation requires constant vigilance. Suicide prevention protocols are active. Mental health checks occur, but officers acknowledge the strain. One former officer, quoted in media reports, said, "You're guarding men who have nothing left to lose. That changes the atmosphere." And yet, for many in Livingston, Polunsky is just part of the landscape. It provides jobs, stability, paychecks. The prison system is one of the largest employers in rural Texas counties. So when people drive past the facility, tall fences layered with razor wire, they don't see controversy. They see work. But from inside a cell, it looks different. Daniel Reyes once wrote in a court filing that time at Polunsky feels frozen. That description appears in public records, whether poetic or literal. It captures something hard to measure. There is no programming, no classes, no work assignments. According to TDCJ policy, death row inmates do not participate in general population activities, and unlike some states that allow step-down programs, Texas historically maintained permanent administrative segregation for death row. In recent years, limited reforms have been discussed, but as of publicly available records, most inmates remain in single-cell isolation, 23 hours inside, 1 hour out alone, every day, year after year. Some inmates have had execution dates set multiple times, only for appeals or stays to delay them. Court records show cases where last-minute filings postponed scheduled executions. Imagine preparing for death, then returning to your cell, and waiting again. The psychological toll of that cycle is documented in various legal challenges, though courts have not uniformly ruled in favor of inmates. And here's the contradiction. Texas is known for its tough-on-crime policies. Yet even within Texas, Polunsky stands apart. It is not a chaotic prison. It is not gang-controlled. It is not loud in the way Hollywood imagines prisons to be. It is controlled, silent, measured. That's what makes it unsettling. Because everything is intentional, everything is scheduled, and time stretches without mercy. The Polunsky Unit does not advertise itself. It does not offer tours. Its name rarely trends, but within the criminal justice system, it is known. Attorneys who represent capital defendants know it. Families of victims know it. Families of inmates know it. And the men inside know it better than anyone. They wake up each day in the same 6x9 cell. They count the days since sentencing. They measure life in appeals. They listen for footsteps in the hallway. Because at Polunsky, the quiet can mean anything. And sometimes, it means your name has been called. For most prisoners in Texas, a sentence means time. Years, maybe decades. But for a small number of inmates convicted of capital murder, the sentence means something else entirely. Death. And the journey to that sentence does not begin at the execution chamber. It begins with a bus ride. According to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, every male inmate sentenced to death in Texas is transported to one place, the Allan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston. It doesn't matter which county the conviction came from: Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, rural East Texas. When the judge reads the verdict and the appeals process begins, the destination is always the same: Polunsky. The transfer usually happens within weeks after sentencing. Former defense attorneys and prison officials interviewed in news reports have described the moment as surreal. Many inmates have spent months in county jail waiting for trial. County jail is loud, chaotic, crowded, but the bus ride to Polunsky leads somewhere very different: silence. According to corrections procedures described in court filings and investigative reporting, the trip typically begins early in the morning. The inmate is shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles, a standard security protocol used for high-risk prisoners. The chain belt wraps around the waist. Handcuffs connect to the belt. Leg irons restrict movement. The system is designed so the prisoner can walk, but only slowly. Correctional transport buses used by TDCJ often have reinforced cages separating inmates from the driver. Windows are small and covered with metal mesh. You cannot see much outside, and the ride to Livingston can take hours. For many inmates, it's the first time they realize the reality of the sentence. Because once they arrive at Polunsky, they are no longer just prisoners. They are death row inmates. According to public records from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Polunsky Unit became the primary male death row facility in 1999. Before that, death row inmates were housed at the Ellis Unit. But after the failed escape attempt in 1998, documented in media reports and prison records, the state moved death row to a more secure facility, Polunsky, built with tighter control, more isolation, more security layers. And when the transport bus finally reaches the prison gates, the first thing most inmates see is the fencing. Multiple layers, chain link, razor wire spiraling in thick coils, security towers positioned at corners. The outer fence is only the beginning. Inside are additional perimeters, controlled gates, and electronically locked doors. Former inmates have described the intake process in interviews and legal declarations. While each experience may vary, the basic steps are consistent with standard prison procedure. First comes identification, photographs, fingerprints, documentation confirming the death sentence. Then comes classification. But here is the unusual part. In most prisons, classification determines where an inmate lives and what privileges they may have. Prisoners can earn lower security levels through good behavior. Death row in Texas is different. According to TDCJ policy, inmates sentenced to death are automatically placed in administrative segregation indefinitely. There are no lower classifications, no work assignments, no path into general population. The label stays the same. Death row. After intake, the inmate is escorted into the housing area. Correctional officers open a heavy steel door. Then another. Then another. Every door locks electronically behind them. This process is called controlled movement, and it is standard in maximum security prisons. But at Polunsky, it is even stricter, because every man housed here has been convicted of capital murder. The hallways are narrow. The air smells like disinfectant and metal. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. According to descriptions from lawsuits filed by inmates and advocacy groups, each death row cell measures roughly 6 by 9 feet. Concrete walls, solid steel door, a narrow window slot in the door. Inside the cell, a metal bunk, a thin mattress, a toilet and sink combination, a small shelf. That's it. No television unless purchased through approved prison channels. No personal furniture. No decorations beyond photographs or legal papers allowed under prison policy. The cell door shuts, and the inmate is now part of the Polunsky system. One former defense attorney, speaking in a Texas Tribune interview, described the moment his client first entered death row. He told me the silence was the worst part, the attorney said, because death row does not sound like a normal prison. General population units are noisy. People shout. Radios play. Doors slam constantly. But on Polunsky death row, many men spend most of their time alone. And when dozens of isolated men begin speaking through air vents or shouting down corridors, the sound echoes strangely through the concrete structure. According to mental health reports cited in lawsuits, some inmates begin experiencing severe psychological distress after prolonged isolation. These claims are contested in court. State officials argue that the system is necessary for safety, but the lawsuits have documented allegations of hallucinations, anxiety disorders, and depression among some inmates. The truth, according to legal experts, is complex. Some prisoners arrive already struggling with mental illness. Others develop symptoms years later, and some adapt to the environment in ways that outsiders find difficult to imagine. Take the case of an inmate we will call Marcus Hale, a composite name used to represent multiple documented cases described in court filings and investigative reporting. Hale was convicted of capital murder in the late 1990s. According to trial records, the crime involved a robbery that ended in a fatal shooting. The jury recommended death. When Hale arrived at Polunsky, he was 25 years old. At first, he believed his appeals would succeed. Many inmates do. Capital cases involve years of legal review, state appeals, federal appeals, habeas petitions, and sometimes the Supreme Court. But while those legal battles unfold, life inside the prison remains the same. Every day begins with count. Correctional officers walk the tier, verifying each inmate is present and alive. Then breakfast trays slide through the slot. The slot is a narrow opening in the door used for passing food and handcuffs. Inmates call it the bean slot. Meals are served inside the cell. There are no dining halls, no group meals. Everything happens alone. According to TDCJ procedures, inmates are escorted to showers several times per week. The process is heavily controlled. First, the inmate backs up to the door. Hands extend through the slot. Officers apply handcuffs. The door opens. Leg restraints are attached. Then the inmate is escorted down the hallway. Even showers occur individually. Afterward, the inmate is returned to the cell. The door locks. Another day passes. Recreation works the same way. Death row inmates are allowed limited recreation time in outdoor cages. Photos published in media investigations show small concrete enclosures surrounded by fencing. Some inmates call them dog runs. The nickname appears frequently in lawsuits and interviews. Inmates are escorted there one at a time, 1 hour, then back to the cell. For years, sometimes decades, Marcus Hale spent his first 5 years on death row filing appeals. He read law books, prepared documents, wrote letters to attorneys. This is common. Many death row inmates become deeply involved in their legal cases because the appeals process can take decades. According to data from the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time between sentencing and execution in the United States has steadily increased. In Texas, it is often more than a decade, in some cases far longer, and that waiting period happens inside places like Polunsky. Meanwhile, outside the prison, life moves forward. Families age, children grow up, lawyers retire, but inside the cell, the routine barely changes. Breakfast, count, silence, legal paperwork, dinner tray, lights out, though the lights never fully go dark. Some inmates develop strict daily routines to cope with the environment. Exercise in the cell, reading schedules, writing journals. Others struggle to maintain structure. Mental health professionals employed by TDCJ conduct evaluations and provide treatment when needed. But critics argue that therapy is difficult in extreme isolation. Those debates have appeared in multiple federal lawsuits over the years. In 2015, for example, litigation filed on behalf of Texas death row inmates argued that prolonged solitary confinement caused serious psychological harm. The state disputed those claims, and courts have issued mixed rulings in various cases. But one fact is undisputed. Death row at Polunsky is one of the most restrictive incarceration environments in the Western world. And for the men inside, the waiting never stops. Marcus Hale learned that lesson slowly. In year 1, he believed his appeals would succeed. In year 5, he believed the courts would grant a new trial. By year 10, he began to understand something else. The legal system moves slowly, but time inside Polunsky moves even slower. One day he asked a guard a question: "How many men have left this wing alive?" The officer reportedly did not answer, because at Polunsky there are only 3 ways out: a successful appeal, a commuted sentence, or a transfer to Huntsville. And when that transfer happens, everyone on the tier knows exactly what it means. There's a number that defines life inside the Polunsky Unit: 23. 23 hours a day. That's how long most death row inmates remain inside their cells, according to policies from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and documentation cited in court filings and investigative reporting. 1 hour outside, 23 hours inside. Every day, every week, every year. For men awaiting execution inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, time is measured in routines that rarely change. And the routine begins early. Around dawn, fluorescent lights hum above the tiers. Some inmates are already awake. Others have barely slept. Sleep on death row can be difficult. Court filings submitted by inmates in various lawsuits have described constant lighting, noise echoing through concrete corridors, and the stress of confinement as factors contributing to insomnia. State officials dispute some of these claims, arguing that lighting and security measures are necessary for safety and monitoring. But what is not disputed is the structure of the day. Correctional officers begin the first count. In prison systems across the United States, counts are routine. Officers visually verify every inmate to ensure no one has escaped, been harmed, or attempted suicide. On death row, the process is strict. Officers walk along the tier. They look through the window slot in each cell door. The inmate must be visible, alive, responsive. The officer marks the count sheet, then moves to the next door. When the count clears, breakfast begins. Meals arrive on trays pushed along a cart. Each tray is slid through the small opening in the cell door. The opening is known among inmates as the bean slot. It's one of the few points where the outside world enters the cell. Breakfast might include powdered eggs, toast, oatmeal, or cereal. The menu varies depending on the day and prison kitchen schedules. Food service inside Texas prisons follows nutritional guidelines required by state regulations. However, inmates frequently complain about quality or portion size in grievances and lawsuits, complaints that are common across prison systems nationwide. Once the tray is inside the cell, the door shuts again. There are no communal tables, no conversation across a dining hall. Just one man, one tray, one cell. After breakfast, the hours stretch long. Some inmates read. Legal books are common. The appeals process in capital cases is complicated, and many inmates study legal procedures intensely. Court records show that some death row prisoners file appeals themselves when legal representation is limited. These are known as pro se filings, meaning the inmate acts as his own legal advocate. Others read religious texts, the Bible, the Quran, or other spiritual literature. Faith becomes an anchor for many inmates, according to interviews published in news reports and documentaries about death row. Some prisoners write letters. Pen pal programs exist in many parts of the United States, and volunteers sometimes correspond with inmates. Advocacy groups, religious organizations, and individual citizens participate in these exchanges. For some men on death row, letters become their only consistent human connection beyond prison staff. Then there are those who simply sit, listening, because even in isolation, Polunsky is never completely silent. Voices travel through the ventilation system. Inmates shout to each other through the air ducts. Conversations bounce through the concrete corridors. Sometimes arguments break out between men who cannot even see each other. Correctional officers call it vent talk. It's one of the few ways inmates communicate, but not everyone speaks. Some inmates withdraw entirely. In court declarations filed by prisoners challenging solitary confinement conditions, several described long periods where they barely spoke to anyone. The psychological impact of isolation has been studied extensively by researchers. Some mental health experts argue that prolonged solitary confinement can contribute to anxiety, depression, and hallucinations. Other experts note that not every inmate experiences the same effects. The debate has become one of the most controversial issues surrounding modern death row housing policies. Texas officials have repeatedly defended their system. They argue that death row inmates present unique security risks and that administrative segregation helps prevent violence and escape attempts. That policy remains largely unchanged. And so the hours pass. Late morning, midday, afternoon. Inside one of those cells sits a man we will call Robert Gaines, a composite character based on multiple documented cases in legal records and investigative journalism. Gaines arrived at Polunsky in the early 2000s after being convicted of capital murder. According to trial transcripts and news reports, the crime involved the fatal shooting of a gas station employee during a robbery. The jury recommended the death penalty. Like many inmates, Gaines entered the appeals process immediately. But appeals take time, sometimes years, sometimes decades. While the courts debate legal arguments, life inside Polunsky remains exactly the same. Gaines developed routines, push-ups, sit-ups, stretching in the narrow space between the bed and the door. Exercise is one of the few ways inmates maintain physical health in confined spaces. Some prisoners walk in circles around the cell for hours. Others create improvised workout routines. Because physical movement is limited, eventually, the cell door opens for recreation. But even recreation happens alone. According to TDCJ procedures, death row inmates are escorted individually to outdoor recreation areas. The process follows strict security protocols. First, the inmate places his hands through the slot. Handcuffs are applied. Then the door opens. Leg restraints are attached. Only after restraints are secured does the escort begin. 2 officers usually accompany the inmate. They walk down the corridor, through several locked doors, into a small outdoor enclosure surrounded by fencing and razor wire. Photographs published by media outlets show these spaces clearly. Concrete floor, chain link walls, sometimes a small view of the sky. The cages are not large. Some inmates describe them as slightly bigger than a parking space. Recreation time lasts about 1 hour. After that, the escort process happens again. Back through the doors, back through the restraints, back into the cell. For many inmates, That single hour outdoors is the highlight of the day. Some simply stand and look at the sky. Others pace. Others exercise. Because once the hour ends, the door closes again. 23 hours inside. That rhythm repeats every day. But what truly separates death row from other prison units is not just the isolation. It's the uncertainty. Most prisoners know their release dates. Even life sentence inmates often know they will spend the rest of their lives in prison. But death row inmates live under a different kind of clock. The execution date. According to data compiled by the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time between sentencing and execution in Texas often exceeds 10 years. In many cases, it stretches far longer. During that time, inmates move through a complex legal process: direct appeals, state habeas corpus petitions, federal habeas review, sometimes appeals to the South Supreme Court. Each stage can take years. Some inmates receive new hearings. Some receive sentence reductions. Others have their appeals denied. And when the appeals run out, something happens that every inmate on the tier recognizes instantly. The execution date is set. In Texas, once the courts approve the final steps, a judge schedules the execution. The date becomes public. Attorneys are notified. Families are notified. And the prison knows. Inside Polunsky, word travels quickly. Men shout the news down the tier. Some pray. Some go silent. Because everyone understands what happens next. The inmate will remain at Polunsky until the final days. Then he will be transferred, not released, transferred to the Huntsville Unit, the location where executions are carried out in Texas. But that transfer doesn't happen immediately. Sometimes weeks pass after the execution date is announced. Weeks where the inmate continues the same routine. Breakfast tray, silence, exercise, legal calls. But everything feels different, because the countdown has started. Robert Gaines experienced that moment after nearly 17 years on death row. His attorney informed him during a legal call. The courts had denied the final appeal. The judge had scheduled the execution. 6 weeks away. For the first time since his arrival at Polunsky, time moved quickly. Because once the date is set, every day matters. And every man on the tier knows exactly what comes next. There's a moment on Texas death row when everything changes. Not the conviction, not the sentence. Those happened years ago in a courtroom. The moment that truly shifts the atmosphere inside the Polunsky Unit happens much later. It's the day an execution date is set. For many inmates, that day arrives after more than a decade of legal battles. Appeals in capital cases move through multiple layers of courts: state appeals, state habeas petitions, federal habeas review, and sometimes petitions to the South Supreme Court. Every step can take years, but eventually, for some inmates, the legal process ends. According to public records compiled by the Death Penalty Information Center, Texas has carried out more executions than any other state since the modern death penalty resumed in 1976. And every one of those executions began with a signed court order. The document is simple. A judge schedules a date, usually several weeks in the future. That single piece of paper changes everything, because once the order is issued, the system begins to move. Inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, inmates do not receive the news through announcements or television. They hear it through whispers, or through lawyers, or sometimes through guards who quietly confirm what everyone already suspects. One inmate's name has appeared on the execution schedule, and on death row, information travels fast. Men shout down the tier. Did you hear? Who is it? What date? Even though every inmate lives behind a steel door, communication happens through the air vents and concrete corridors. And when an execution date becomes public, the entire wing feels the shift. Correctional officers notice it too. Former staff members interviewed by journalists have described the change in mood during those weeks. Some inmates become quiet. Others become restless, because the reality of the system becomes impossible to ignore. Someone they have lived beside, even if they have never seen his face, is about to leave, for good. And everyone knows where he's going. To the Huntsville Unit, the prison where Texas carries out executions by lethal injection. But before that transfer happens, there is a period known among inmates as the last weeks. The man scheduled for execution remains inside his Polunsky cell while attorneys pursue final appeals. Even after a date is set, legal efforts continue. Defense lawyers often file emergency petitions asking courts to reconsider evidence, review procedural issues, or grant a stay of execution. Sometimes those petitions succeed. According to legal records, several Texas executions have been halted just hours before they were scheduled to occur. But many are not. And during those final weeks, the routine inside the prison changes in subtle ways. The inmate receives more legal calls. Attorneys work intensely during this period, filing motions and communicating with courts. Spiritual advisors may begin visiting as well. Religious counselors are allowed to meet with death row inmates under prison regulations. Some prisoners request these meetings. Others decline. Every inmate reacts differently. Take the case of the composite inmate we introduced earlier, Robert Gaines. His execution date was scheduled nearly 17 years after his conviction. According to the court timeline in cases like his, that length of time is not unusual. Capital cases are among the most heavily litigated cases in the American legal system. When Gaines' lawyer informed him that the final appeal had failed, the conversation was brief. The execution date had been set, 6 weeks away. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Gaines knew exactly how many days remained. Court filings and interviews with former inmates suggest that reactions to execution dates vary widely. Some prisoners remain calm. Others experience severe emotional distress. Some write letters constantly during those weeks. Others stop speaking entirely. Psychologists who study death row environments say anticipation can produce intense stress. But measuring that stress is difficult because every inmate is different. Inside his cell, Gaines reportedly began writing letters to family members, letters to friends, letters he had never written before. For years, he had believed the appeals process might save him. Now the calendar said otherwise. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the case began appearing in news reports again. Local newspapers often publish articles when execution dates are scheduled. Victims' families are notified by the state. Advocacy groups sometimes organize protests. Religious leaders sometimes issue statements. The death penalty debate resurfaces briefly. Then the news cycle moves on. But inside Polunsky, the date remains, day after day. The final weeks also involve logistical preparations inside the prison system. According to procedures from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, inmates scheduled for execution are eventually transferred from Polunsky to Huntsville. The move typically occurs within days of the scheduled execution. Huntsville houses the execution chamber used by the state. But until that transfer occurs, the inmate remains in his regular death row cell, waiting. And while the scheduled inmate counts down the days, the rest of the tier watches. Because every inmate knows the same thing could happen to him someday. Some prisoners have lived on death row for more than 30 years. Others arrive and receive execution dates within a decade. The timeline is unpredictable. Legal outcomes vary, but the possibility remains constant. And when one man's date approaches, the entire wing feels it. Former inmates have described the sounds that travel through the corridors during those final weeks. Prayers shouted through vents, conversations about appeals, arguments about guilt and innocence, sometimes silence. One former death row inmate, interviewed years after leaving prison, described it this way: "You're living beside a clock, but you don't know when your turn comes." The correctional officers assigned to death row also feel the tension. Their job requires maintaining order in a place where emotions run high. Security procedures remain strict. Counts continue. Meals continue. Recreation continues. But everyone knows the system is approaching its final step. And then the final week arrives. According to Texas execution procedures, the condemned inmate is transferred from Polunsky to Huntsville shortly before the execution date. The move usually happens quietly. No announcements. No ceremony, just another escorted transport through secured gates. For Robert Gaines, that day arrived on a gray morning in early spring. Correctional officers came to his cell before sunrise. They applied restraints through the door slot, handcuffs, waist chain, leg irons. The process was identical to any other escort, but the destination was different, because this time, the bus was heading somewhere else, and everyone on the tier knew exactly where: the Huntsville Unit, where Texas executions take place. But the journey there is only the final chapter, because what happens inside Huntsville is something few people have ever seen. For years, sometimes decades, life on Texas death row follows the same pattern: steel doors, concrete walls, 23 hours inside a 6x9 cell. But eventually, for some inmates, that routine ends. Not with release, not with parole, with a transfer. And on Texas death row, every inmate knows what that transfer means, because the final journey does not happen inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit. It ends 45 miles away, at the Huntsville Unit, the prison where Texas carries out executions. The transfer usually happens just days before the scheduled execution. According to procedures described by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and confirmed in court filings and investigative reporting, the condemned inmate is moved under heavy security. The process begins early, before sunrise. Correctional officers approach the cell quietly. The inmate is instructed to turn around and place his hands through the slot in the door. Handcuffs are applied. A waist chain follows, then leg restraints. Only after the restraints are secure does the cell door open. 2 officers escort the inmate down the corridor, through several locked doors, across controlled security zones. The walk is short, but it is the last time the inmate will pass through those hallways. For years, that corridor was the center of his world. Now it is behind him. Outside the building waits the transport vehicle, windows covered, security staff stationed nearby. The inmate is placed inside and secured. Then the vehicle leaves the prison grounds, and the journey to Huntsville begins. The drive takes less than an hour, but it marks the final stage of the Texas death penalty process, because Huntsville houses the state's execution chamber, a small, controlled room that has become one of the most well-known execution sites in the United States. According to public records compiled by the Death Penalty Information Center, Texas has carried out hundreds of executions since the modern death penalty era began in 1976. Nearly all of them occurred inside the Huntsville Unit. When the transport arrives, the inmate is processed into a separate holding area. This section of the prison is specifically designed for inmates scheduled for execution. Unlike the years spent in Polunsky, the time in Huntsville is short, usually less than 72 hours. During this period, the inmate may receive visits from attorneys, religious advisors, and family members under controlled conditions. Final appeals may still be filed. In some cases, courts issue last-minute stays. Legal records show that executions have occasionally been halted hours before they were scheduled, but many proceed as planned. And if the courts do not intervene, the schedule continues. Execution day in Texas typically occurs in the evening. Witnesses begin arriving hours beforehand. According to official procedures, several groups may observe the execution: family members of the victim, family members of the inmate, journalists representing news organizations, and selected prison officials. The execution chamber itself is small, clinical, a narrow room with a gurney positioned at the center. Glass windows separate the chamber from the witness rooms. Medical equipment stands nearby. The process used in Texas is lethal injection. According to documentation from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the protocol involves administering a lethal dose of pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate. The drug is intended to render the inmate unconscious before death occurs. The procedure is carried out by trained personnel, following strict guidelines. As the scheduled time approaches, the inmate is escorted into the chamber. Restraints are removed and replaced with straps, securing the inmate to the gurney. Medical lines are inserted. Witnesses watch through the glass. A prison official reads the execution warrant. Then comes the final opportunity for the inmate to speak. In Texas, condemned inmates are allowed to make a final statement. Some apologize. Some proclaim innocence. Some thank family members or spiritual advisors. Others remain silent. According to execution transcripts released by the state, these statements are recorded and preserved as part of the public record. When the final statement ends, the signal is given. The drug is administered. Witnesses watch. Minutes pass. A doctor eventually confirms death. And with that confirmation, the execution is officially complete. The time of death is recorded. The witnesses are escorted out, and the process that began years earlier in a courtroom reaches its final conclusion. Back at the Polunsky Unit, the cell that once held the inmate is now empty. For the men who remain there, the routine continues exactly as it did before. Breakfast trays slide through the slot. Counts are conducted. Recreation cages open and close. 23 hours inside, 1 hour outside. The system does not pause, because another inmate still occupies the next cell. Another appeal is still moving through the courts. Another name may appear on the schedule someday. According to statistics from the Death Penalty Information Center, the number of executions in the United States has declined over the past 2 decades. Some states have abolished the death penalty entirely. Others have imposed moratoriums. But Texas continues to carry out executions under state law. And as long as that law remains in place, the Polunsky Unit will remain the place where inmates wait, sometimes for decades. The prison sits quietly in the pine forests outside Livingston. Most drivers passing on nearby roads never notice it. They see fences, guard towers, concrete walls. But behind those walls is a system built entirely around waiting. Waiting for appeals, waiting for decisions, waiting for dates. For some inmates, the waiting ends with a new trial. For others, a commuted sentence. But for many, the waiting ends with the final transfer to Huntsville. A bus ride, a chamber, a record in the state archive, and then the cell door closes again on the next man. Because inside America's most isolated death row prison, time never truly stops. It simply moves to the next name.